So our next speaker is an awe-inspiring human who has done more than 3,000 injury-free parachute jumps over the last 15 years. He's an entrepreneur and an executive coach, and he's very interested in where self-reflection, motivation, and survival meet. Please welcome Brett Kistler.
17 years ago, I made my first base jump. And what I expected to experience on that day was intensity, adrenaline. And I got that, but what I also experienced was presence and calm. When I found myself in free fall, my thinking mind stepped aside, my identity stepped aside, and I found myself experiencing the world directly with my senses. And this isn't something that I had been used to experiencing. I was used to thinking my reality with my mind. And so I was hooked. For 15 years, I went down the rabbit hole and I collected some amazing experiences around the world, and I continued to follow that thread of presence that I found while jumping. And people would ask me, are you some kind of adrenaline junkie with a death wish? And I'd respond, no, I'm a presence junkie with a life wish. I just wanted to experience everything, and I wanted to experience it fully and be there for it. And I didn't just want to be there for it in the sky while I was flying. I wanted to be there for it while I was on the ground in my everyday life. So I'm going to tell you about 3 key perspective shifts that occurred for me that helped me bring that presence from the sky into my life on the ground. The first one, of course, being fear. My relationship to fear started as that I thought it was something that I could conquer. I thought that if I could overcome my fear, if I could overcome it, then I could do anything. I'd be unstoppable. But in reality, I'd actually been controlled by fear and anxiety for my entire life. I hadn't been letting myself feel it. I wasn't even aware that it was there. Turns out that jumping gave me a chance to experience fear on my own terms. And so, over the course of my career, I started to recognize that the more I allow myself to feel my fear, the more it orients my attention to what's important, and it grounds me into reality. And whether I'm doing a new kind of jump that is scary, or whether I'm speaking on a stage, or whether I'm starting a new company, the more that I welcome my fear as a trusted advisor and a friend, I don't need to control it. I don't need to manage it. And the more present I can be. So the next perspective shift was around freedom. Now, I came out of the gate craving freedom. I wanted to be free from all the rules and expectations of society, of religion, of authority. And so I started to jump the tracks of every form of limit that I could find and see around me until I eventually came up against a set of very hard limits: the laws of physics, gravity, aerodynamics. Finally, a set of rules that I could trust. So I found while dancing within these limits that freedom is actually an internal thing, because it doesn't matter what the external limits are. What matters is how I relate to and how I engage with those limits. So for example, while I'm making a jump, I have to operate within a very thin margin for error. And outside of that margin, the consequences are immediate and swift and savage. And so, meanwhile, what I actually find is I find a deep freedom in these moments because I'm actually taking full responsibility for my experience. So finally, identity. And this one took me a long time to come around to. I used to think that identity was something that I would be building up. I would find out who I'm going to become, and then I would eventually step into that identity and become it. So I started to cover myself with the logos of sponsors, and I started to organize my life to be invited to new events and maximize my reputation and opportunities. Meanwhile, I was actually creating a whole new set of expectations for myself, and those expectations can be a liability. And after I started to see how many accidents were happening around me in the sport, ultimately many of them driven by identity-related decisions, I started to see how tragic identity can be when unexamined. So I took a step back and I started to explore the web of beliefs that underpin my identity, and I started to feel the unfelt emotions that were holding those beliefs in place. And so instead of building up my identity, I started to allow my identity to unravel. And I found that the less attached I became to who I thought I was and who I thought I was supposed to be, the more present I could be with reality as it actually is in any given moment. And so this is how I finally found a way to bring the presence that I found while flying into my life on the ground. By holding my identity lightly, I can find the clarity to find the freedom in any constraints. And with an identity that doesn't need defending, and a freedom that requires nothing, fear becomes excitement, and it becomes the thing that gives me guidance to my next steps in life. Thank you.